Hi everyone, welcome back to the second episode of the Cantarus Podcast. I'm Tabby and we've got Sam, also from the marketing team. And today our special guest is Chris. Chris, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi everyone. So my name's Chris Gray. I am the Principal Consultant for Infrastructure and Security at Cantarus. Basically, that just means I am in charge of a lot of the design and kind of implementation of our own Kalani infrastructure. As well as a lot of the security scanning and kind of security operations within the business.
Okay, thank you. So in today's episode, we're kind of going to be lifting the lid on everything cybersecurity, which is always a bit of a hot topic. So I guess the first sort of question is like, if I was looking to get started, where do I start?
Well, it's almost the most difficult part, right? It's getting started with something. Usually, it's getting an understanding of what does cybersecurity look like? What is good cybersecurity? You can spend millions and millions of pounds buying as much cybersecurity appliances and software and all sorts of things, but if none of those make sense into some sort of useful system at the end of the day, then you've just wasted your money. So I think if you're looking for somewhere to start, it's about finding out what good cybersecurity is, whether you pick a framework, so pick a Cyber Essentials Plus or something like that, and then go away and achieve that certification. Cyber Essentials is a pretty good one to start with because it covers a lot of the kind of base requirements, or whether you go and find a consultant who can come in and tell you exactly what you need to do, which fits in with your business, finding out what does that good cybersecurity look like and what applies to my own business, not just what cybersecurity, because what cybersecurity is for one company might not be the same for someone else. So it's about finding out what is good for you, not just good generally, I guess. So it's about finding that correct fit for your budget and for your business, whatever size it might be. And then from there, I guess, understanding, do I know what I'm protecting? So do you know where all of your servers are? Do you know what suppliers you're getting your hosting from? Do you host it yourself? Do you know what machines are sat in your data center? Do you know if you have a data center? Is it all sat in a cloud somewhere? And those things lead to different security requirements within the business. So you might need to protect those things in different ways. Or if I'm holding someone's name and address, then that's maybe not as important, or maybe not as require as much security as something like someone's credit card number or their date of birth or whatever else you might have stored in there, or maybe their password details. So it's about knowing what you have, where it is, and how you need to protect that to make sure that it's safe from potential attackers, I guess. Once you've got that, then it is then kind of working out, again, how much scanning do I need to put in place? How much security do I need on those actual tools which I have? Do I develop my own software? Do I need tools to protect that software and what I'm writing? Or is it just going to be sort of SaaS products and I just need to make sure that people's logins are secure? So again, it's about scoping and kind of protecting that information.
Yeah. So what are some of the most common cyber attack methods that we're seeing being deployed at the moment?
I think usually, universally, sort of between 80 and 90% of attacks now are all pretty much human error based. So they're usually due to some lack of loss or weak credentials at the end of the day. Basically, I think almost all the reports that have been published recently are 90% when it's gone back to the root cause. So you'll probably not necessarily find this original, you'll find something else within the network or within your application which is wrong. But then when you trace it back to a root cause, the root cause is usually something which is human error, be that weak credentials, loss of credentials, some sort of misconfiguration along the way. Are usually the three which you'll find are actually the root cause analysis of an issue which might affect your business at the end of the day. So we see a lot of things like malware and sort of viruses and I guess sort of crypto attacks. Those are becoming more and more frequent, but again, usually the root cause is back to some loss of credentials somewhere.
Yeah. Going back to the human error point as well, there's a statistic I'm aware of that that half of people who found a USB stick in a car park would subsequently plug it into their home or work computer. So that gives an example really of how I suppose it plays on people's curiosity, doesn't it, a little bit? In the same way that phishing emails might try and bait people into opening them. There's something about even the idea of finding a USB stick that something about a human mind will inquire, oh, I wonder what's on this. And even though you know it's a risk, people will go and take those risks. Definitely see how human error could be one of the biggest risks.
Definitely. I've done that before. Even, I think it was when I first started working at Cantarus, and I remember getting an email through from our COO. Well, that's what I thought. And it was like something about buying Amazon gift cards, and I just opened the email not even thinking, because it just looked so legit. And I remember obviously speaking to you, Chris, and being like, I don't know what's from this. It really isn't from who I think it's from. So it is obviously really easy to do, even if you're, I don't know, an intelligent person.
Yeah, exactly. And a lot of them look so convincing now, because they'll almost send, if you send a spam email to someone, then if you send one every day, then at some point you're going to get a bounce back, right? Because they're out of the office for whatever reason. And then effectively what you've got their signature. So then you can make your email look exactly like their email, because you can just copy their signature. It's got all their contact details in, might have a nice little picture of them. So you can make them look so convincing, because you can almost do a bit of engineering before you run your phishing campaign to go like, well, it looks 90% of the way there. Maybe the request doesn't quite make sense, but the email looks like it's legit. And then you're like, well, okay, maybe it almost becomes like has to be a culture within your business, as well as having all of these nice security things which automate scans or that will check emails before they arrive. At the end of the day, there has to be some sort of security culture within your business, and people have to have that understanding and have some sort of training almost to be able to pick up those emails. A lot of them you can tell pretty easily, because it's got really bad grammar in it, or there's no use of capital letters or whatever. Or they usually, a lot of the time nowadays, they will tell you to go outside of the normal channels, because they know there's some sort of scanning in there. So they'll tell you to send us your phone number so we can add you on WhatsApp or whatever. So yeah, there's a lot of that going on at the moment. It's very much the number one risk probably for loss of credentials now.
Yeah, the most recent one I received was from our CEO, supposedly, and the first thing that did was try to move me onto a text conversation. Assuming that quite reasonably the majority of staff at a company won't have the CEO's personal phone number, so you wouldn't be able to easily verify that. So it's definitely happens on a fairly regular basis. I think for Cantarus, there's been recently quite a few people have mentioned receiving those CEO phishing ones, and it's exactly what Tabby mentioned. He then the person will then tell you that they're in a meeting with some clients, and they need to provide gifts as a sweetener, and you need to go and buy gift cards and send the numbers for those gift cards over so the money can be transferred.
Almost attack vector as well, because it's interesting, because usually when we've done a bit of investigation into it previously, we tend to find that they use LinkedIn quite a lot. So obviously they'll follow a business on LinkedIn and they'll go, oh look, they've added a new member of staff, and then email formats are usually pretty easy to guess, because it'll be first name dot last name or whatever. So using tools like that, they're not malicious tools, they're just tools that hackers have available in them to just harvest that information.
And then you're much more likely to catch somebody out with something like that in their first week of employment. When they're more keen to impress and they don't really know everyone. And
they've never spoken to the CEO anyway, because it's their second day or whatever, so they don't know how they might make those requests.
Absolutely. It's clearly a lot of thought going into it.
I was just going to say, what about stuff like passwords then? So I know that we now, we put all of our passwords into like PMP, but I imagine there's lots of businesses that maybe don't do that, and might choose like a really obvious password like the pet name or the birthday or something. Is that correct?
They're exactly the same thing, right? Because if you're using your date of birth or whatever in your password, then how hard is it to find that out? It's not that difficult, probably. Via multiple places, be it Facebook or whatever accounts you might have out there although you think it might, again, it's the same with any amount of security, right? It comes back to human error. So I might think I've secured my Facebook account, but if I've accidentally ticked one box wrong, then maybe you can only see my name and my date of birth, but that's enough to get into someone's account maybe. So yeah, I mean, it's always coming back to having again, culture of security within the business, but also ensuring that things like password policies are in place and that everybody in the business knows about that password policy. And if possible, have it enforced automatically. So effectively having some sort of tool in place which will enforce secure passwords across the business rather than letting people set them and then hope for the best in the future. That one of the main ones, sort of as part of that password policy, should be never reuse it. So all your passwords should be single use for a single application or website or whatever. You should only ever use one in one place, which is where your password managers and that kind of thing come in.
So it seems to me that the password manager is the safest option, because if you have a password policy where you make people change passwords every 2 months, then within a year they've gone through 6 new passwords. And by that point, they've probably gone through all the passwords which are actually safe and secure. And they're now desperately trying to think of something they can actually still remember. And they can't use their strong passwords because they've used them all already. And so then they end up choosing something like a pet's name and a date of birth at that point. So forcing people to change passwords on quite a regular basis can have a counterproductive effect of actually over time weakening the passwords being used by the organization.
Yeah, exactly. It's actually one of the things which is recommended now, certainly by people like Microsoft and the likes of those massive companies, is you don't change your password. You set your password at the start, and then I guess we'll probably come onto it later on, maybe around some zero trust kind of stuff. It's effectively you don't use that password. You set it once to set up your account, and then you add additional factors of authentication on top of it, which are better than a password, because I think it's probably pretty well known that passwords aren't great for a security perspective now, because you can just guess them. Whereas if you use things like multi-factor authentication, you have to have multiple devices, or you have to have access to someone's phone, or however you choose to do that multi-factor authentication. Things like biometrics and sort of fingerprints and Face ID and that kind of stuff are a lot better, because people don't obviously have to remember it. They don't forget their fingerprint.
Definitely.
So having things like multi-factor authentication, I think it started off as a nice to have. It used to be nice to have MFA. Now we're at a point where it should be MFA everywhere. And I think we're moving more and more to a culture where passwords are dead and it will be multi-factor everywhere effectively.
Okay, so I think we've covered the idea of human error, password policy, and misconfiguration as common cyber attack methods. So next we're going to move on and look a little bit at application vulnerability, but we will be bringing in a guest to help us discuss that a little bit. So we'll be joined now by Samir from Appcheck. So Samir, perhaps you could tell us a little bit about Appcheck and what your role is there.
Hi, Sam, and thanks for having me on the podcast today. Really looking forward to getting stuck into some interesting topics. So yeah, it's very, very simply put, I head up our channel partnership program here at Appcheck, and I ultimately support our partner network in the industry to support their organizations that they work with, their clients within projects to help them with their security posture, specifically around automated test and vulnerability scanning of their web applications and key infrastructure. And to put more context about Appcheck and what we do as a business, for those who don't already know, ultimately we're a SaaS-based product platform that allows organizations to automate the discovery process of vulnerabilities on these applications, web applications, and infrastructure targets, in order to provide them technical analysis and remediation information around the vulnerabilities that we've discovered, so they can fix these vulnerabilities in a timely fashion before ultimately somebody can exploit those maliciously. I think a good place to start when we're talking about application vulnerabilities, look, there's so many vulnerabilities out there that we can talk about. There's a lot of things going on from an exploit perspective that we can talk about, but I think a good place to start off with would be somewhere around the OWASP Top 10. Now, some people listening to the podcast today may or may not be aware of the OWASP Top 10, that's certainly something that maybe we can link some resource to, and you can look into it in more detail. But ultimately, the OWASP Top 10 is a set of vulnerabilities that get published by this non-profit council that ultimately highlight the most prevalent vulnerabilities we see in the industry from time to time over the years. Various vulnerabilities in there that we've seen, and really hasn't changed over that time frame. From the most recent publication, I think, was in 2021. The one before that was in 2017. And in that time frame, vulnerabilities that we see most commonly out there have changed again. But time and time again, as I mentioned, things like cross-site scripting, injection type vulnerabilities, these vulnerabilities aren't going away. They've been around a very, very long time. And having something in place at a bare minimum for organizations to look for and detect for these vulnerabilities on a frequent basis is probably a great place to start off your security testing strategy. From an automation perspective, there's other variants of type of testing you can do, i.e. penetration testing, manual pen testing, etc. But definitely a good place to start focusing in on that top 10 perspective. To go a little bit deeper into that, I think, a good place to start, yes, OWASP Top 10, but there is certainly so many more vulnerabilities beyond the OWASP Top 10 that we can definitely look at and analyze as well. Again, we're not going to have time to go into all this in massive detail today, but we do see things like parameter pollution vulnerabilities. We do have a great article that I think we can maybe link, if possible, into the description somewhere for organizations to take a look at in more detail. And that really goes into a lot more information around vulnerabilities that you might not necessarily expect to see as commonly as some of the ones in the OWASP Top 10 in that sense. And, here at Appcheck, we run thousands and thousands of scans on a weekly basis for companies in various different industries and sectors, whether it be enterprise, SME, the public sector industry. And time again, we do see the common vulnerabilities from the OWASP Top 10. To go back to that briefly, like the likes of injection type vulnerabilities, cross-site scripting. But moreover, we're starting to see more and more often these types of vulnerabilities that kind of fall outside the OWASP Top 10 when it comes to web application detection, or vulnerability detection, I should say. So yeah, it's certainly an area that I think companies should be looking at to begin with at a bare minimum, the OWASP Top 10, but don't always get so focused in on just focusing on the OWASP Top 10. There's so many more things out there that you've got to, keep your eye over on those particular exploits.
Absolutely. I think one of the reasons we started using Appcheck at the very start of our relationship, I think, was because of those integrations you have with like CMSs and that kind of stuff. And being able to pick up version vulnerabilities and that kind of thing, because it's getting a big area of attack nowadays. If you know there's a vulnerability in your underlying software, it might not be something you've written in there. It might be something which is lying around across thousands of sites. And Appcheck's really good at finding that kind of stuff.
Yeah, and interested in that idea of the top 10 that you mentioned. So who is it that actually produces that top 10 list?
OWASP themselves.
Okay.
I can't sit here and tell you that I'm a complete OWASP expert in that sense, but there's a lot of resource on there around the chapters there's various chapters around the UK, Ireland, and globally really that contribute to this type of content, and sort of there's a whole OWASP Top 10 around API testing, for example, and various bits around security testing. So definitely, people interested or unfamiliar with the topic, we do have articles on that we can supply, but also there's information out there in the web you can quite easily go off and gather as well.
Yeah, I think we'll definitely link to some of those further resources in the description of this one. It sounds like, so are those top 10 lists kind of the it's like the digital equivalent of not walking around central London taking pictures of the buildings, because that makes you look like a tourist, and that's what the pickpockets are after. It's just kind of,
I don't think necessarily exactly in that case, but these vulnerabilities are typically the most common, and maybe the through statistics that are analyzed, the most common sort of ones that are probably a lot easier to, in some cases, not always, there's different variants of these vulnerabilities that can be quite easily exploitable. Quite often, as a bare minimum, these are probably some of the attacks that somebody who was a malicious would be looking for. We're trying to find if we can execute that quite easily on a web application. So to speak, you could say ultimately that maybe, low hanging vulnerabilities in a way, but that would also discredit some of the people out there that are able to do some really complex stuff and discover these vulnerabilities that can be more complex. It's still fit within the OWASP Top 10. So it's not to say that these are necessarily all easy to achieve and could still fit within that particular framework, but very common, and often if they are exploited, very damaging to an organization. Hence the list is sort of gathered there to give a bit of a guideline on what to look out for at that level to begin with.
It's quite interesting to see how they change over time as well, usually, because I'm pretty sure SQL injection's been in the top 3 for about 17 years or so.
Yeah, it's been around.
It's crazy that people aren't already catching that. It's been there. It's been in that top 10 for all this time, and yet still people are falling foul of it when they're writing their SQL code. It's pretty crazy that is still going after all this time. But it's quite interesting to sometimes look at some of those trends, because you can kind of see as people pick up on things and code slightly differently, or they change the frameworks based on what vulnerabilities are being found, those kind of drop down the top 10, but then other ones start to come back up again, because people aren't thinking about it, they're thinking about the new thing which is coming at number 1, but then sort of other things creep back in again. It's quite interesting to check some of those top 10 trends and kind of see how they change over time and make sure you kind of protected against all of those, really. It's like a minimum specification for these are the things you definitely should be checking. These are the things which are most commonly found, so this is what you definitely should be looking for. Making sure you check your application before it goes out and gets attacked by anybody, really.
And it was interesting that they've obviously added the API one relatively recently as well, which is slightly different than the web app piece. And the reason I mention that is one of the big things that we've been doing a lot of work on is really improving automation testing around APIs as well. So not only are we hitting the web application, but for us, we're seeing a huge growth in more modern type applications being built, single page applications built around frameworks like React, Angular, Node.js, etc. Very API driven. So having that ability to not only tackle that front end, but with it being very JavaScript heavy and a lot of the data being driven through the API, being able to hit that API endpoint too, it's kind of another topic we're flying into there, but it's certainly one that resonates with organizations that definitely build their own SaaS-based products, developing their own products, especially if they're very API driven. It's a key area that they're looking to really focus on as part of the security improvement of their external state or even internal state from an application perspective here.
It's also a really good target for a hacker, because you're more likely to get a lot more data out of an API than you are out of a web front end of some random website somewhere. If you can get the API, you can just give me a list of all the users and all the passwords, and that's exactly what you're looking for, right? So if you're going to target that, that's a great place to start.
Absolutely.
The last bit I think we're going to look at is the idea of external attack, and this is kind of framed under the question, is a firewall enough?
Today, though, I'd have to say, and Chris can probably either back me up on it or discredit it, but I don't find that many of these discovery calls or organizations I have these days would really highlight that they've got a firewall too much. Maybe the odd organization, very rare. I think most organizations are more aware of the type of thing that they're trying to achieve in terms of security testing. They know the firewall serves its purpose and it's an important piece of the puzzle, but it's one piece. This type of testing is another. So again, Chris, you may have seen other elements.
No, absolutely. I mean, you can have all the firewalls you like. If you don't know what the configuration is on them, then they're completely useless. Like, a lot of problems you see with firewalls nowadays is almost you configure it at one time and then things change and then you never go back and reconfigure the firewall. And definitely one of the benefits of being able to scan that kind of thing is look for those open ports and go, why have I got a mail port open when it's not need to be open? Can someone exploit that open port to connect to another application, which I don't necessarily think they should be able to, and it shouldn't be in the firewall config, but it's not just having a firewall in the correct place, it's having all the process to back it up and make sure your change requests and everything are going through and making sure that you're actually protected rather than just having the device and having a box there is not completely useless, I guess. But if you're not controlling that configuration and making sure you know what policies are going through that firewall, then it's not really all that useful to make sure that it's actually there. You may as well just leave it open to the public.
It's probably worth highlighting as well. We've all seen huge breaches in the industry, in the media, I should say. Very high profile organizations at times, and these companies probably have huge budgets for security. They may have multiple firewalls, as Chris has said, and they're probably doing everything they can, but ultimately, you can just see there from that evidence that just having a firewall in place, these organizations spending that type of money, it still doesn't guarantee that you're fully secure, or there may be an exploit there you're unaware of. So trying to do as much as you possibly can, almost like taking security like an onion. There's layers to it. There's the firewall piece that we've got here that we were talking about briefly. We're talking about automated security testing that the likes of Appcheck would do here. We're talking about today that there's static analysis. There's so many things you can throw into the mix as part of that. But ultimately, if you could do everything, if you had a never-ending pot, then obviously you would do everything you could, I would say, to help protect your brand and your organization's data and employees, customer data. But ultimately, it's about risk appetite and understanding what things can you do fall within your means to be able to do that, to proactively look for vulnerabilities and remediate those in a timely fashion.
Yeah, absolutely. It's the same with all security stuff. It's all risk reward, isn't it? It's what your budget is, how much have you got to spend, how to sort of assess where that risk is, and then how do we plug that gap? I think it's always the same process with all security jobs, I think.
Yeah. So perhaps a good time to discuss how do you know if that security is working?
It's a good question. It's a good question. Look, I don't think anybody could sit here and tell anybody that, hey, you are going to be 100% secure because we've done this or we've done that, or because you're doing this and doing that. I think it's probably safe to say that I don't think that truly exists, a nirvana of that. But we just kind of exactly what we just talked about there, doing everything you possibly can to try and secure your applications infrastructure, which is the key focus on today's talk, is important to review. And ultimately, a good way of sort of discussing about it is what are you currently doing? Have a think about what are you as an organization doing to look for vulnerabilities across your external and internal estate, whether that be applications and infrastructure. And that takes me on nicely to so conversations I have on a regular basis with organizations that they may do an annual pen test or biannual manual penetration test for those of there want to look up more detail about what that is if you're unfamiliar. And they'll get a consultant and they'll do the pen test, which is great. Deep dive into the applications and network, provide a report, and then also more in-depth analysis, no doubt, about what they discovered, etc. Help with remediations. That's great. The organization that had the penetration test carried out can go off, make some fixes, and so on and so forth. But for us, a huge shift we're seeing in the industry really over the last few years is to incorporate more automation into your security strategy. So I can imagine a lot of people listening to the calls today will definitely be conducting a pen test annually, or certainly have had one done in the past. But what we've seen is a gap of automation. And what I mean by that, and why companies are moving towards that, and it's kind of why Appcheck was originally designed, specifically around testing web applications initially before moving into infrastructure as well, was a lot of organizations we would typically work with would do a pen test every year. But the gap was, well, their development teams would make regular changes to their web applications. They would add new features, new functionality, all brilliant stuff, working towards projects on a continuous basis. The problem they had, though, was, well, we had a pen test 3 months ago, but we've done a huge update and added all these new things last week. So what do we do now? Do we wait till next year to verify and check that all this nice new stuff we've introduced? Thinking of our security cap for a second, have we introduced any vulnerabilities? Has that stuff that we've introduced caused us an area of concern from a risk perspective? Could it mean that we could have data stolen? Is there a vulnerability that's exploitable, like an SQL injection attack? And they would have absolutely no idea or way of really looking at it in great detail. They may be able to run some basic tooling maybe, but not to the level of detail that you would probably hope that, or getting as close to maybe a pen test would do. So what we've seen, and this is where I've gone with the shift in the industry really, is a lot of organizations are now automating testing in between their pen test, for example. So if you get a pen test today, you've got some sort of platform in place, as an example, like an Appcheck that sits in the background, a SaaS-based product that will allow you to test as often or as little as you like. So a lot of organizations we work with will test for vulnerabilities on a regular basis, every single month on production, pre-production environments, for example. And what that allows them to do is catch potential vulnerabilities they may have introduced themselves. And that's not because anybody's doing anything wrong. Development and some of the projects I've worked with some organizations, some of the stuff that the people are working on, really cool things, are extremely complex. Chris can probably articulate that even more with his background, but some of it isn't as easy as, board level. It might be a case we need a brand new application and does all this functionality, make it happen. Team Cantarus, Chris, get it out there, and you'll do great work and it'll be working unbelievably well. But ultimately, there's a lot of pieces to that have to come together to get it to what it looks like on the web. And a lot of that can be complex. So being able to automate and look for vulnerabilities when you're making these types of changes on a consistent basis gives you a lot more proactive assurance around your current security posture. We can find vulnerabilities, allow you to remediate those vulnerabilities in a timely fashion and move on with your projects ultimately. Leaving it annually just from that manual pen test, there's a huge gap there. There's a huge window that could potentially lead to an exploit. I don't know, maybe if Chris might have more to articulate there than myself, because I know you work heavily and have done in the development world.
Yeah, definitely. It's also, I mean, as well as having the new vulnerabilities and finding those as you go along, it's obviously the earlier in the process you pick them up, the better off you can be, because obviously if it's been deployed to a live site, then chances are it might have already been exploited before you find it. So it's a matter of if you can pick that up during the development sprints or even before it gets deployed to anything which is publicly facing. Certainly something which you can build in as an automation as part of your sort of continuous integration or as part of your software development lifestyle, just to pick those up and make sure that almost as a development sprint completes, you can run a check and you can pick up any errors which get picked up at the end of that sprint, and it can get addressed before any information is even pushed to an actual live site. So having that automated scanning in place, it's just an additional step you can put into that continuous integration process. And then hopefully you don't get anything which goes out onto public site, which is going to get exploited. So yeah, anything you can do to pick that up beforehand, because chances are you don't want to pay a manual tester to come in and go like, it's £1,500 a day or however much it is to test something which doesn't really exist because you've not built it yet. So having that automated scanning and having the ability to do it as and when you need to do it is a massive benefit as part of that process, and to make sure that you're secure before you push anything out into the public eye. Because there's been a bit of a culture change in kind of businesses around security, and the fact that they were almost, security used to be an afterthought. So it used to be you put your website live, you wait 6 months, and then you give it a security scan. Nowadays, that's not really enough. It has to be part of the entire process, and everything has to be secure first and not security as an afterthought.
Okay, so a big thank you to Samir for joining us today, and we're going to carry on the discussion a little bit with Chris for now. But yeah, thank you so much, Samir, for joining us. My pleasure. Thanks for having me on. Okay, so having covered the most common cyber attack methods there, we're next going to have a little look at a checklist, I suppose, of do I have the simple stuff covered? So, Chris, what are those basics that somebody can run through to check their cybersecurity status?
Yeah, no problem. So I guess looping back to the start, I guess, where we sort of covered some stuff in the beginning around what the kind of basic principles were around passwords and that kind of stuff. I guess if you want to start from the very beginning, would be with sort of user accounts. So make sure everybody has an individual user account. Never, ever, ever use an admin account for anything. Don't log into servers with an administrator account. I know it gets created when you start the server, but everybody has their own account. That way, everybody's attributable for exactly what they do effectively. And effectively, if you do have a compromised account, you can shut down that account very quickly rather than having to go away and sort out the mess afterwards. Password, make sure you've got a strong password policy. So once everybody's got their own account, make sure you've got a good password policy in place and make sure that that is actually adhered to. be that by automated tools or by making sure your business culture and sort of has some sort of policy in place, or almost a written policy which people sign up for and make sure that they are actually reading that and almost reading it once it when it changes. MFA, so make sure you have multi-factor authentication enabled absolutely everywhere. Just go away. If you can switch it on, go and switch it on. People will complain, but you're better off doing it and letting them deal with it than the alternative, effectively. And then I guess we can move on to sort of more application-focused things. So making sure that you have a regular patching process. There's, as we mentioned with Samir, there's those 0 days that are out there. They're getting released almost on a weekly basis now. Some of them are tiny things which you'll never see. Some of them are absolutely massive. So just make sure you have that patching process in place. Make sure all of your servers, all of your software is updated and running the latest version of everything. People hate doing it. People hate installing Windows updates last thing on a Friday, but it's not worth the alternative. Just make sure there's, if it's not part of your security culture within the business, make sure you have some sort of tool to force it into people's actual process. Otherwise, they may or may not do it. And then, I guess to a degree, make sure you have a plan. As we've already talked about, this kind of stuff is becoming more and more frequent, and it's more and more of an exploited area. So it's almost not a when, or almost not an if I will be attacked now. It's a when will I be attacked? And then making sure you have some sort of plan in place and make sure that that plan is known across the business. Make sure that that plan has been tested and you basically is well known, so you can actually execute that once you are attacked effectively, because at some point it will most likely happen. But how you deal with that can make a massive difference. So having everybody sat around for 6 hours because they don't know what they're supposed to be doing, all of your data might be gone by that point. So you've got to have something in place to make sure that everybody knows what they're doing, who's dealing with what do I need to address, and almost have a structured plan for almost every situation, if you can go down that route, just to make sure that you know what you need to be doing. And then I guess on top of that, going down the route of having things like Cyber Essentials or ISO 27001 and that kind of thing, having those frameworks, they're a great place to start, especially Cyber Essentials, because it covers a lot of those very sort of simple things which will stop 90% of the attacks against your business. So making sure that all of those things we've just mentioned are in place, and making sure that you have a good baseline of security before you might want to move on to other things like Cyber Essentials Plus or ISO.
Yeah. So so Cyber Essentials, it's an accreditation that's kind of a process and a checklist that will take you through a number of things that will get you to a certain level of security that is kind of government stamped as a reasonable level to hold, isn't it? That's essentially the idea behind something like
Absolutely.
Cyber Essentials.
Yeah, so it's a government run scheme. So basically they provide a list of sort of well-known baseline specifications. So actually you have to have it now. So if you do want to tender for any government work, you actually have to have Cyber Essentials as a minimum now in order to just tender for any of that work. But it does give you a great baseline place to start. So if you are starting from almost nothing, or you're starting from the very basic, I've got a password manager, then moving to Cyber Essentials and going through that process, and then up to Cyber Essentials Plus. So it's probably worth explaining the difference between Cyber Essentials and Cyber Essentials Plus, maybe. So Cyber Essentials gives you a list of those things which you need to pass in order to get a Cyber Essentials certified, which will run you through that whole process. And then when you go for the Plus edition, you actually get assessed. So there's an assessor which will come in and check your answers to those Cyber Essentials certified questions, and do some scanning and some actual testing on your user devices to make sure that those are actually in place. So it's almost like a assessed version to make sure that a third party has come in and is checking the answers to the questions you've actually provided.
Yeah. So I suppose another aspect to consider for some companies is knowing whether or not their team internally has the right skills to handle cybersecurity. or whether it's something that may need to be outsourced. So how would a company be able to go about trying to make that kind of decision?
Yeah, absolutely. It's the same as anything, isn't it? With resourcing, especially in IT departments, you tend to find that they're very sort of under-resourced as a team. Although people will be busy going around and checking laptops and making sure people can do their day-to-day work, they also have all these other IT tasks which are thrown up, or IT and security tasks which are thrown upon them. A lot of it is about understanding and interpreting the results of all these sort of technologies you put in place. So things like Appcheck scanning are great because they'll go away and provide you with a list of all these things which are wrong, and they'll give you a sort of a basic almost idea of what the solution to that problem is. If you don't understand what that report's giving you, then how do you pull that back into your process and go, I need to address this one, and this one first, and get some sort of priority assigned to those issues. So if you've got a list of issues and then you don't really know where to start, then you weren't any better off than when you didn't know you had any issues, maybe. So it's about making sure that you have the correct skills to interpret what you're being told. Exactly the same process with manual scanning as well, because they'll come back and give you a report and say, you know, here's all the things which are wrong, but they're not going to help you fix them unless you're paying them to fix them. We work quite closely with Appcheck and provide almost an Appcheck managed service. So we can set up those scans for you, make sure they're running correctly. Again, back to having the correct tools, but not having them almost set up correctly. It's all a vicious circle. So we will go in, we will set them up for you, run some initial scans to help you sort of run through and interpret those results. And then almost depending on what application we're scanning, we can help you fix those things. Or we can always provide you with a prioritized list, maybe, and some background knowledge to a bit of those things which Appcheck are providing you with, around which ones you need to go about fixing first.
Yeah. So there's not really a fire and forget solution for this at all. You need to be engaging with what the results are, and either you need the expertise within the company, or you need to work with consultancy to be able to interpret that, or else there's not much point in having those in place.
Yeah, absolutely. Because it's all right running your vulnerability scan and going, I've got to run a vulnerability scan, but if you don't go and fix those things afterwards or do something with those results, then there's no point running the scan in the first place because you're not actually doing anything about it. So it's about being able to have the correct skills in place to be able to interpret that. Yeah.
There's no point just knowing that you've left the front door unlocked. You need to actually go back and unlock it.
It's the same with home automation stuff, isn't it? My front door tells me if my front door's open, but if I'm 6 miles away down the road, it's no help to me.
Yeah.
It doesn't shut the door for me. It just gives me some background information, right?
Yeah. So to close off the cybersecurity discussion today, then, have you got any hot tips for the future of cybersecurity? What's on the horizon at the moment?
I think it is a massive area at the moment. There's a lot of stuff out there, and again, kind of as we said earlier on, it's about picking the correct thing for your business. I think one of the major things we did mention earlier is this move to a whole passwordless culture, things like zero trust and SASE, having these environments which there's no real difference between what is in front of the firewall and what is behind the firewall. You just go with a totally secure environment and you give people the correct access for what they need. So it's that minimum requirements to do what you need to do. So it's not giving everybody those admin roles, and there should be no difference between a user which is employed by you and an actual user of the website. It's just a difference in permissions almost. So having those tools and being able to have that culture of being able to go like, well, what I want is a secure environment, not a secure environment in front of my firewall and then an insecure environment behind my firewall. It has to be a whole system and make sure everything works as one go. And I think there's a lot of effort going into this zero trust and making that a lot easier for users. Because we have all these things like VPNs and all this other stuff which allows you to remote access. But when you're actually using them on like a day-to-day basis, now people aren't necessarily in the office and all that kind of thing. there's been this big culture shift, and it has made a lot of people's life either A, less secure, or B, more hard work, because they're having to put different credentials in their VPN than their other login systems and all that kind of thing. So having this single approach of zero trust and kind of this single login application, which will protect your entire infrastructure, I think is a massive area for growth. And then it's the same with the rest of the world, I guess. So things like AI and that kind of stuff will come into almost picking up attacks as they're ongoing. So being able to have some sort of automated system, which will be a lot better probably than any human eye that's looking at it. It'll be able to look at every single packet, which is your network, and go, where did that come from? Why did it come into the network? And sort of, was it supposed to be there? So being able to pick up those things with AI and get some sort of detection on it will give you a lot better overview than what we probably would currently get. A lot of what we have is quite good for things like IPS, which will do some reputation scanning and that kind of thing. But I think things like AI and being able to use those big kind of data warehouses of information which are out there will be able to help a lot with that cybersecurity side of things. And it'll almost be about defeating the AI rather than trying to get into a firewall or find a hole in an application.
So as well as seeing AIs used for detection and response, are we going to see them used on the other side as well, to actually look for and exploit vulnerabilities?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think some of that's already out there, I would imagine. So maybe not on the same degree as you see with a lot of the AI detection, but using those automated tools. So it's something we've seen a lot of. And again, we mentioned it earlier on around 0 days, and the increase in these 0 days is because people can use these sort of automated tools to be able to go and scan. So whereas someone previously might have been one person sat in their bedroom tapping some code in, has now become you just set off a tool which then scans the entire internet. So there's no manual integration needed for that. So you get so many more hours in a day than you would do with someone just sat there tapping in some code to try and find a vulnerability. You can just automatically scan it.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that's happening more and more, and I think it'll work both ways.
Yeah, I suppose the fact that it's less targeted makes it in some ways easier to protect yourself, because it's a bit less personal. When it is one person kind of sat in their room choosing a company as a target, that's quite a personal attack. But so long as you don't make yourself in the 10% of most easily exploitable websites, you're going to be safe from a lot of stuff. It's the thing of, I don't have to outrun the bear, I just have to outrun you.
Yeah, exactly.
It's that kind of approach. Don't let yourself be the person lagging at the back of the pack, because that's where the targets are.
It's very, I guess there's going to be a very small amount of businesses which are going to be targeted by actual targeted attacks. So when you get these nice state-sponsored attacks where you see all these Cozy Bear and all this lot out there attacking people, that doesn't happen all that often. When it happens, it's probably pretty big, which you kind of saw with a lot of the stuff a couple of years ago, where they actually got in and got into the into some of their internal tools and then managed to branch out from there. That doesn't really happen all that much. So it's about doing the stuff which is going to stop the basic attacks, which can be automatically picked up. I mean, we kind of mentioned the Appcheck scanning and you being able to scan on that continuous basis. Effectively, that's what the hackers are out there doing. They have similar tools, probably not as clever as what Appcheck's doing, but on a similar level, it knows what vulnerabilities it's looking for, and all you have to do is say, there's the internet, off you go and find me something to exploit.
So I think that kind of covers everything that we wanted to talk about today. So thank you again, Chris, for joining us. And thank you for listening as well. If you want to continue the conversation, you can connect with you guys on LinkedIn, if that's okay. Also follow Cantarus's page as well if you want to keep updated on future podcasts that we're going to do. And we're always posting our insights and blogs on there as well. Stay tuned for the next one, and thanks again for listening.
Yeah, we'll leave Chris's details in the description box for the episode. And thanks again to Samir from Appcheck for joining us today as well.